Hello and welcome to Spectator TV. I'm William Atkinson, the Spectator's assistant content editor. 2 years ago today, Sudan collapsed into civil war. Despite little coverage, it is now the world's largest humanitarian crisis. Tens of thousands have died, and 13 million people, more than a fifth of the population, have fled their homes. The UN classifies nearly 650,000 people as living at imminent risk of starvation. The fighting first broke out in 2023 between General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, head of the armed forces, who was in effect the country's president, and General Mohamed Hamdan Dagalo, known as Hemedti, leader of the Rapid Support Forces, or RSF. Today, looking at a map of Sudan, you can see how the SAF have accelerated their advance to encompass the entire capital, Khartoum, the epicenter of the war. Nearly three-quarters of all attacks have centred in three regions: Khartoum, Gezira and North Darfur. Gold and international politics also play a huge role in this conflict. But as Sudan burns and people starve, the gold trade is humming. In fact, production and trade have surpassed pre-war levels. Hemedti and the RSF have controlled some of the country's most lucrative gold mines. Reports also suggest that the UAE has used Wagner mercenary groups to ship arms to the RSF, a militia now accused of committing genocide by the United States, and which has been sanctioned. On a diplomatic level, this matters for Britain because the UAE has traditionally been one of our closest allies in the Gulf and has long-standing dealings with the RSF, though it strongly denies involvement. This week, foreign ministers from 20 different countries are meeting at a conference organised by David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary, to try and find a pathway to peace.
I've seen the impact for myself on Sudan's border with Chad, where almost 1 million people have fled for safety. I said then that I would bring together the international community to address it.
Let me be clear, the UK will not forget Sudan.
And now I'm delivering on that promise. Foreign ministers and leading humanitarian agencies will come together in London to agree a way to ease the suffering and to get humanitarian aid to where it's most needed.
But what can Britain really do? And why has the world turned its back on such a terrible atrocity for so long? To talk about this conflict, I am now joined by Spectator writer Paul Wood, and I'll later be speaking to someone stateside who's been covering the war since it began, Cameron Hudson. So Paul, what is the situation in the Sudan? Who are the major players in this conflict, and how has it developed over the last 2 years?
It's exactly 2 years today since the Sudanese civil war started, or the latest iteration of a civil war. And Amnesty International calls it a day of shame today because this is a forgotten humanitarian catastrophe. It's a conflict on an enormous scale. One estimate is that 200,000 people have been killed, more than 8 million internally displaced and 3.5 million refugees. There have been atrocities on both sides. These essentially were allies who overthrew the civilian government in 2021 and then fell out 2 years ago. You have the Sudanese Armed Forces on the one side, who are still officially the government of Sudan, and you have the RSF, the Rapid Support Forces, as they were called, essentially the old Janjaweed militia, Arab militiamen. On the other side, they've actually been accused of genocide by the UK, the US, and human rights groups. And Amnesty International accuses the world of turning away from this. They say that while Sudan burns, nothing is being done. That's not entirely true, because today also the British government has convened a meeting of 20 countries at Lancaster House to try to take the first steps to see how to end this terrible conflict.
And so why do you think this conflict hasn't attracted more attention before now? And what chances do you think this conference has of achieving anything tangible?
Nothing tangible, I think, immediately, not least because the two factions have not been invited, the Sudanese Armed Forces and the RSF. I think these are about first steps towards getting a ceasefire, humanitarian intervention, and as you say, getting the world to pay attention, because for whatever reason, the world has been looking elsewhere while Sudan, as Amnesty says, has burned.
What have been the roles of foreign powers in this conflict so far? I mean, for example, Russia and the UAE have both been linked to the export of gold from Sudan.
Well, there are many layers to this conflict. It's partly a tribal conflict. It's partly a global warming conflict, a conflict about water and fights over fertile land. And as you say, it's also about gold, with Russia and the UAE accused of interfering and backing different sides. And not just them, Saudi Arabia and Egypt, for instance, back the Sudanese Armed Forces. The UAE backs the RSF. There is at the moment a case before the International Criminal Court accusing the UAE of complicity in genocide, accusing the UAE of arming the RSF. That's an accusation made by others, including members of the US Congress. Now, the United Arab Emirates denies that it is arming the RSF and calls the case at the International Criminal Court a publicity stunt by a very sophisticated, almost Russian-style disinformation campaign waged by the Sudanese Armed Forces. But I think we can say that both sides have committed atrocities, and on a vast scale. It's only the RSF, though, I think, who's attracted this accusation of genocide so far.
And what can you say about those sort of accusations of genocide, particularly, of course, in the Darfur region, only 20 years on from the sort of ethnic cleansing of 200,000 people there?
Well, I covered that campaign 20 years ago, and some of the horrific stories stay with me to this day. The Janjaweed militia, which means devils on horseback or devil riders, were accused then of wiping out whole villages. And I remember just as a famine was taking hold in Darfur, arriving at a refugee camp and meeting a group of people who'd been on foot for 10 or 12 days. A small child was terribly burned, and the story that we got from his mother was that they'd been on a bus. People had been separated according to their IDs. That's the allegation of genocide there. The men were shot, a pile of corpses were made, set alight, and then this small child, 4 or 5 years old, was thrown onto the pile of burning corpses. Little boy did survive. He was taken to an MSF hospital. So we're seeing a repeat of these kinds of atrocities, but perhaps on as great a scale or an even larger scale. In one town in Western Darfur, a report to the UN Security Council spoke of 10 to 15,000 people being killed in one place in essentially one incident that unfolded over a period of time. And we have allegations again of sexual violence, of mass rape, of the deliberate killing of intellectuals, of torture camps, of starvation being used as a weapon of war, of people fleeing, 80% of people in some parts of Western Darfur fleeing over the border to Chad. This is in many ways a replay of what happened in 2004. But as you say, there's gold, there are allegations of support from outside powers. And of course, the civil war has reached into the heart of the capital, Khartoum, as well. There's no longer a US or British embassy presence there. The place is being fought over.
Yes, on the particular subject of Khartoum, the government forces recently retook Khartoum. And how important is that, and how likely is a military resolution to this conflict?
Well, certainly symbolically important. The Sudanese Armed Forces have got the presidential palace. But if you look at a map of Sudan, and this is a vast country, I've flown over, it takes hours and hours. Essentially, it's split between east and west, with the RSF or Janjaweed, as some people call them, in the west, and the government forces in the east. So this is a long, long way from being resolved, and I don't think there is a military end to this. There's possibly what people call a mutually hurting stalemate. There's maybe international pressure for a ceasefire. Nobody's talking about international peacekeepers. It's hard to see how this ends quickly, and blood is still being shed. As we speak, hundreds of thousands of people are on the move. Reports of killings are coming in every day. It is the world's worst humanitarian catastrophe, and yet, as we've been speaking about, very little attention is being paid to it.
Quite. And what do you think the impact on Europe might be? There are sort of some reports from some NGOs that a majority of those arriving across the Mediterranean and sort of illegally are sort of from Sudan. You know, there's been a 60% increase in sort of Sudanese migrants arriving in small boats in Britain just over the last year, and with more than a fifth of the country's population displaced from their homes. What is the sort of likely sort of future, say, refugee flows from Sudan northwards?
Well, we live in a global market for migration. Obviously, people are fleeing to Chad first or to Egypt, and a lot of them are stuck there. It takes a lot of money to get smuggled across the Mediterranean. I've interviewed people who've paid 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 euros to get taken from West Africa all the way up through the Med to Italy or Lampedusa, the island where they first land. But you can expect, I think, eventually to see a lot of, 3.5 million people. Some of them are going to have the money to pay the smugglers and get into the small boats. So yes, we will be seeing an impact on migration. I guess that is one reason why the British Foreign Secretary David Lammy says don't forget about Sudan. The other reason being that terrible crimes against humanity, atrocities, war crimes are being committed on a vast scale there.
Paul Wood, thank you very much for joining me. Cameron Hudson is a senior fellow at the Centre for Strategic and International Studies, and he joins me now. Thank you for joining us. Cameron, you wrote for Semamour last month that it looked likely that the war in Sudan could be reaching its final phase. Do you still think that's likely? And if not, how useful will today's set of talks be for reaching some form of resolution to the two-year-old conflict?
Well, I think the argument that I make is it's really up to the Sudanese army whether or not this is the last phase or whether they intend to try to carry this war out to what they hope will be total victory for themselves over the rapid support forces. So I sort of paint a kind of fork in the road here. I think that by taking the capital as they have and other strategic points in the east and central part of the country, they really control the kind of tactical and strategic high ground right now in the country. They could use that to press for a kind of political solution to end this conflict and to oversee the dismantlement in a legal sense of their enemy, the rapid support forces. What I fear, however, is that they're going to use the kind of wind in their sails from retaking these strategic points to prosecute the war even further, to chase the RSF into Darfur, and to move the fighting in a much more intensified way to the peripheral areas of the country where people will continue to suffer. Humanitarian access will decline even further, and the war could drag on for years. It just might not be dragging on in the center of the country or the capital of the country, which is the area that the army, I think, cares the most about.
So, expanding upon that point, why would the SAF be interested in continuing the war in that way, rather than coming to some form of, I don't know, sort of tacit stalemate or consolidating its hold over the parts of the country it already possesses? Is that simply because of the deep sort of enmity between it and the RSF, or are there actual sort of greater sort of strategic or indeed sort of economic concerns related to retaking the rest of the country under its own control?
Yeah, so I think there's probably three reasons that are motivating the army to continue fighting right now. One, as I said before, it has the advantage, and it believes, whether rightly or wrongly, that it can actually militarily defeat the rapid support forces. I think, secondly, the continued fighting justifies the army's hold on power. It justifies a military government remaining in power in the country, especially if they can bill themselves as the liberators of the country, as having liberated the people of Sudan from the tyranny of the rapid support forces and the atrocities that they have been committing. But I think the third element rests on the responsibility of the international community. I think that the army doesn't view the international community as a good player, good actor in this. They don't trust in the international community's ability to act in an even-handed way. The international community from the UK, the United States, under the Biden administration, and others have held both sides in this conflict equally responsible for the war, equally responsible for the overthrow of the previous transitional government, and certainly equally responsible for the atrocities that have been committed against civilians in the context of this war. And so, given, I think, the hard line that the international community has taken against the army, they probably don't see a lot of good reason to open themselves up to a political negotiation that could see them on the losing end of a negotiation that they're winning right now on the battlefield. And so I think all of these reasons are conspiring against the cause of peace in Sudan right now.
And could you expand upon what we mean in this particular context by the international community? Which powers have been sort of most involved in these sort of situations in Sudan, either as supporting either of the rival sides, or of trying to bring a resolution? And what does this mean for the actual sort of makeup of those attending this sort of meeting in London today?
Yeah, so I think the international community we could probably break into three different categories. The sort of classical sense is the Western powers that have traditionally aligned to use their influence to try to bring an end to this conflict and conflicts like it. So that would be the US, the UK, the EU, and Western powers that are promoting peace and security, prosperity, even democracy in Sudan. We have seen the influence and leverage of those countries really decline and erode over the course of this conflict. You're seeing from Washington now really a very big step back in terms of our diplomatic interest in trying to resolve this based upon history. So that's one set of countries. I think there's the sort of near regional countries, which would include the Gulf states like Saudi Arabia, UAE, Turkey, increasingly, which I think you could put in the category of taking sides in the conflict, benefiting, but having a long-term view of wanting to see Sudan in their strategic orbit, whether for economic reasons, political reasons, or geosecurity reasons. All of these countries are taking sides in the conflict, aiding one side over the other, because they have a long-term interest in the country. And then there's the neighboring states, all of which at this point are involved in this conflict in one way or the other. It could be in a passive way, like we have seen in Central African Republic, for example, or South Sudan, where their territories have been used by smugglers, by the kind of war economy, taking weapons, but also taking smuggling mineral resources out of Sudan and being sold or being diverted to neighboring states, which are benefiting in pretty meager ways, quite frankly, but significant nonetheless. For very poor countries. Then there's countries like Egypt and Chad, which have taken a real direct side in the conflict, are providing at a state level resources and weapons, or allowing their territories, in the case of Chad, to be used by countries like the UAE to funnel weapons into the country. So those countries, I think, all have a stake in this conflict. They're all worried about the potential spillover effects of this conflict. But they are playing, I think, a more modest role in the conflict right now. Maybe there's a fourth category of countries that is probably specific to Russia and Iran, which are outside, I think, of the region, but are playing a role nonetheless because they see strategic value in befriending Sudan, essentially the possibility of having a base on the Red Sea, which both countries are trying to leverage from the Sudanese army right now. And it allows them, I think, to kind of punch above their weight in the Red Sea region, to put pressure on Western alliances and Western interests. So I think those are the chess pieces that are arrayed across this battlefield in Sudan.
And with the particular example of the UAE, they've sort of publicly denied that they are supplying arms. So do we have credible evidence of that? Is this basically an open secret?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is an open secret. I think that they have done a lot to establish plausible deniability for themselves. There is a UN panel of experts report, which I've seen, which has not been released publicly yet, but is going to be released in the next few days, which essentially says that there continues to be a host of military transport planes going from UAE to Chad, and arms shipments going from Chad to Sudan, to the Rapid Support Forces. What those UN reports say is that these UAE transport planes turn off their transponders for long periods of time when they are over Chad and over Sudan. So there is plausible deniability. They cannot connect the final dots in this investigation right now. Now, there have been previous efforts, notably by the New York Times in the last 18 months, that have used satellite imagery to establish military weapons being unloaded at airstrips in Chad, and those weapons finding their way into Darfur. So it has been established certainly in the past, at the start of the war, that the UAE was funding and fueling this conflict through weapons transfers. I think more recent efforts by the United Nations to follow up on those investigations, what we are seeing is that the UAE is getting better at hiding its hand in this conflict because it has maintained publicly, as you say, that it is not playing a role.
Separately, on the terms of the actual sort of prosecution of the war, to what extent have either side of the sort of two major players limited themselves to military targets? What are we to make of the allegations and increasing evidence that sexual violence, the use of starvation as a weapon of war, and indeed even genocide are currently taking place as part of this conflict?
Well, all of that is true, and there's abundance of facts on the ground to support those charges. I think that what we are seeing increasingly is the use of sexual violence, rampant use of rape, sexual slavery, even by the rapid support forces. There are academic databases that are measuring the number of attacks that are going on and the location of these attacks. What those show is that 3/4 of all crimes against civilians have been committed by the rapid support forces, 1/4 committed by the army. But I think that when you drill down on the patterns of violence, what you see, largely speaking, is the army bombing what are civilian targets and creating civilian casualties. By and large, that's the bulk of their that's the bulk of the crimes against civilians that we're seeing from the army. And I think there's a reason for that, which is primarily that the RSF, as a militia group, is using civilian populations as human shields. They are hiding within residential housing areas. They don't have proper bases of their own. And so when they blend into the fabric of society, as they have done since the start of the war, when they are targeted by the army, there is a high level of civilian casualty that occurs. But on the other side, the RSF, what we're seeing is really a high degree of what I would call personalized violence. This is not happening from 35,000 feet. This is happening one-on-one. This is happening by the RSF going door to door in the communities that they besiege, taking women, killing men, destroying civilian institutions and civilian life-saving equipment, whether that's hospitals, whether that's power plants, whether that's roads and bridges. So really depriving communities of ways of life, and then on top of that, going in a very assiduous fashion, door to door, driving people from their homes, ethnically cleansing areas, and committing as various human rights groups have alleged, and the United States government has agreed with, acts of genocide in the course of this conflict.
And with all that evidence there, Cameron, and with the fact that this has now been going on for 2 years, and the fact that we've got 13 million displaced, 600,000 odd people at the 600,000 people facing potential famine, at least 25 million in some position of sort of food insecurity. Why has it taken 2 years for the international community to be having meetings like this and to sort of try and bring some sort of resolution to this conflict? Have we simply not been paying enough attention to, the atrocities that are being perpetrated in what has been described as, the world's greatest humanitarian crisis?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we can say that not enough attention is being paid to this conflict for sure. But I also think that there is a lack of political will right now in the international community to solve this conflict. I think that, this goes back to where I started, which is I think that Western countries, which have traditionally played, I think, the lead role in both providing humanitarian assistance, but also serving as mediators and peacemakers in the various conflicts in Sudan and in the wider Horn of Africa region, we've seen an erosion of that influence, whether it's from the US, the UK, the EU, And at the same time, we have seen rising influence and rising leverage from this group of middle powers, the Gulf states, Turkey, Egypt, all of whom have taken sides and have a stake in the outcome of this conflict. And so I think that these two forces are conspiring against moving forward towards a peaceful outcome. And so this conference that's happening in the UK today, I think will shed some important light on the current status of the conflict, but I think it's going to do very little in terms of putting pressure on either the warring parties who are not invited to the conference or to some of the regional actors who are benefiting. I think it'll do very little to change the dynamics that are fueling this conflict internationally.
The situation remains bleak. Well, thank you, Cameron Hudson, very much for joining us.
Thank you.